Some musicians say that you know you've made it when Weird Al starts to parody your work. In a similar vein, you could say that the genre became a thing in the late 70s because that's when people really started making jokes about it. And to be fair, the standard fantasy tropes are pretty damn silly, so there's a lot of stuff to make jokes about. But ever since the genre had been a thing, people have been satirizing it. For example, Bill the Galactic Hero, a spoof of military sci-fi, and really the military in general, came out in 1965. Or in 1969, we had a work called Board of the Rings, produced by the guys who would go on to make the National Lampoon. I'll let you guess what they were making fun of there. But starting in the late 70s and leading into the 80s, that's when you would see more and more genre parodies start to pop up. In 1978, you get the first book of Robert Asprin's Myth series. And then also in 1978, you get the radio play version of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And then a year later, the novel version would come out. Or, moving on into the 80s, The Color of Magic, the first Discworld novel, came out in 1983. Pratchett is really noteworthy for the fact that the Discworld novels started as cheesy fantasy satire, but they soon wound up, really becoming social commentary and almost transcending the genre, so to speak. And, he was such a good writer that Terry Pratchett was even knighted in 2009, which is not something you can say about most of the people on this list. Or in a more obscure work, but a personal favorite, Marky Rogers' Samurai Cat series started in 1984. They're cartoonish and violent and filled with shameless puns, and that's why I love them. They're kind of hard to find, and the problem is, every time I talk about them, I keep on having to explain that they're not the Samurai Pizza Cats TV show, which is another thing entirely. But finally, the biggest bit of genre comedy to come out of the 80s was Mel Brooks' Spaceballs. Even as various writers began playing around with the generic sci-fi or fantasy tropes in comedy, the genre itself would go on to branch out and do new and cool stuff in the 80s. See, the cool thing is that all of those authors and subgenres I've mentioned in previous episodes, they kept on going. For example, Isaac Asimov, he became famous during the Golden Age, but he kept writing up until his death. In the 80s, he even merged his two most famous series, the robot novels and his Foundation novels, into one continuity, which may or may not have been a good idea. But likewise, ideas from the new wave sci-fi movement began to filter over into fantasy in the 80s. Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon looked at Arthurian legend from a female perspective, or Ellen Kushner's Sword Point played around with a fantasy of manners. Instead of going on a quest, it's all about courts and gossip and things. And it also incorporates a homosexual relationships as well as the swashbuckling sword fights. And that last part, not a euphemism. But the most famous subgenre to come up in the 1980s was cyberpunk. There's a lot of cyberpunk stuff out there, but the two most famous cyberpunk works are William Gibson's Neuromancer and, on film, Blade Runner. Cyberpunk is gritty and noir influenced, and it's typically set in a future where everyone is hooked on personal technology and big corrupt corporations rule everything, and there's neon everywhere, and, well, aside from the cyborg laser eyes, it's pretty much the kind of world we're living in today, so score one for predictive sci-fi. Cyberpunk is one of the most 80st subgenres out there. On a purely stylistic level, the neon and chrome is a twisted reflection of the general 80s look, but deeper than that, the themes of corporate corruption and advancing technology directly tie into developments in the 1980s economy. Heck, even the prevalence of Asian imagery in a lot of cyberpunk goes with the general fear of the time that the Japanese would stage an economic takeover of America through the power of cheap consumer electronics. Now, cyberpunk was so successful that the punk suffix would go on to get a lot of use when chopping up more subgenres, for better or worse. For example, steampunk also was a term coined in the 80s, a term used to sort of describe throwback to old Jules Verne style scientific romances. Now, the funny thing about steampunk is a lot of the time it features some poncy English nobleman as the main character, which really isn't very punk at all, but I digress. Now, moving into the 90s, we would see the development again of another subgenre that would go on to really become one of the more popular ones on the shelves today. I am, of course, talking about urban fantasy, or paranormal romance, or really, I'll go into the difference or lack thereof next time.